How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this week's Lumix Live. We've got an exciting conversation today with my good friend Matt Frazer, who's waiting in the wings right now, as I can watch him laughing off screen. But yeah, so as you guys are probably well aware, we have a huge firmware package update coming for the S series cameras over the next, about 2 weeks now? Yeah, just about over the next 2 weeks. So Matt and I wanted to take the time this week after, kind of letting the update kind of sit out there, let you guys formulate your kind of questions that you're going to have about it, and then address them during this week's stream. So if you've been here before, you know the drill. Tag at Lumix cameras before your questions so that we can see it here on the screen. Matt and I will be addressing as many of them as we can today. And obviously, if we don't get to it, we apologize live. But you can always work through the Lumix Live at us.panasonic.com if you've got additional questions or topics that you want us to cover, that kind of thing. But we'll cover more of that near the end of the stream as well. Again, so if you've been here, you're going to hear some of the same spiel that I give every single week. We always are going to be talking about our Lumix professional services platform here in the United States. And we do have this available in other regions. So just because we're based in the US, that's why I'm talking about the US platform. But this is our support program and our services program for varying different levels of content creators out there. If you are just a kind of casual user and you want to make sure you have some base level protections for your equipment, make sure you check out the Lumix Pro Services Red level here in the US. That's going to get you your 3-year warranty. It's going to get you in the system. So if there is ever any kind of issue that you have with it, you'll be able to jump in there and get yourself taken care of. But if you're a kind of more hardcore user, someone who really puts your equipment through the test, make sure to take a look at the Platinum level membership. That gets you a really cool welcome package that's got a nice Peak design sling strap in there with it. You get that 3-year warranty. You get faster turnaround time on repairs. You get discounted out of warranty repairs. You get your annual sensor cleanings and EVF and lens calibration stuff and firmware updates. And you get a direct membership hotline into our service team. So definitely worth checking out if you are a demanding user of the Lumix equipment. The Platinum service is a paid service, like pretty much all of them, so as you'd expect. But the service is much, it's a more tailored system for that. So, with that, I'm gonna bring Matt Frazer in on this here, and let's kick off talking about the firmware updates. What's up, Matt? How are you?
I'm doing well, Sean. How are you doing? I'm very excited to hear what sort of questions we're going to have today. I can't imagine there'll be very many.
No, not at all. I'm sure everyone's got kind of full understanding of everything that's going on in these cameras as I try to find the power button on this monitor. Yeah.
Here's what I'm really looking forward to, though, is for you to push the "hang up on me" button right there that everybody can see from the
yeah
the Google Meet program we're using right now. So
still working on some of that stuff. For some reason,
I know.
The newer release, it's all good.
I know. But I have to give you a hard time. So.
Well, of course. This is to be expected with us here. So now that the whole Laurel and Hardy bit is done, let's kind of get into this.
Let's jump into it. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Obviously, there's a ton that has been released with the update last week, and we've already covered the BGH1 updates pretty specifically last week. So we are going to link to that video if you're here for BGH1. But we've got some slides just like last week, because we wouldn't be an electronics company if we didn't have PowerPoint slides.
And to be fair, I don't think we could remember everything off the top of our head. There's a ton of updates to these cameras.
Exactly. So, we were both talking about this, leading up to this, how do we want to structure this? How do we want to get this information out? And I think, one of the first things that you and I talked about was, let's kind of just give an overview of what's coming out in this update. Do you want to go ahead and kind of give a rundown of some of the key things that are coming out?
Yeah, so I think first there's an overarching update to all the S-Series cameras plus the BGH1 that will add the ability to either embed or not embed metadata for vertical filming. So you have the option now to be able to say, I want the metadata there so that when I bring this into a timeline, the image will look vertical. Or if I want to shoot vertical for a project where I'm actually going to be mounting TVs vertical, I can choose to have that information be embedded so that I can do it, so that the editing software will recognize it, or the television will recognize it was vertical and play it correctly. I'm totally explaining that poorly, but that's going across all of the BGH1 and S series cameras. So that's 100% on all of them. All of the S series cameras, because they are on a bit of a newer architecture for how the shutter mechanism works through the remote port, they've become fairly popular for people to do what's called camera trap photography. That's where you're doing work for National Geographic and you put cameras in the jungle and you have them in traps, and there's a motion detector that wakes up the camera and it can start taking pictures once it's done that, or start running video when it does that. Because of the way that the remote port works on the S series, we had a lot of people using them, and they were using power supplies inside the camera traps, and they were putting a battery eliminator into the camera. And so when you put that battery eliminator into the camera, our cameras don't go to sleep anymore. They stay on the whole time because they assume they're on wall of power, which means they run those batteries pretty quick in those camera traps. So what we've done is we've elected to allow the power saving functions in the S-Series cameras to be turned on or off when they're on wall outlet power. So one note is that if you're going to be using your S-Series cameras for live streaming, like what Sean and I are doing, or you have them in a studio setup, when you update the firmware on those cameras, you're going to want to go into the power settings and make sure that you turn off the sleep mode. The cameras will sleep now, whereas they weren't sleeping on you before when you were on wall power.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an overarching thing that's happening on all the cameras. The S1H, I don't think a lot of people are excited about this feature, but it's going to get Blackmagic RAW. Are you familiar with that one? Have you heard of it before?
Small little stuff.
Yeah, I know. I think there's one or two people who use Davinci Resolve that might have interest. So for those of you who know, this is a total joke. Blackmagic RAW is a very popular feature we're adding to the camera. Davinci Resolve is the most popular color grading software in the world. So it made perfect sense for us to add that functionality to the S1H. The S1 gets a whole slew of features. I'm not even going to go through them because we're going to talk about them in detail. You all can read on the screen right there, but we'll go into them in a bit more detail. Obviously, you're getting RAW and you're getting expanded video functionality up to an open gate 6K capture. It's a very in-depth update to the S1. And on the BGH1, just final to cover some of the additional features that got added. Or you can watch the video. You get RTSP live streaming functionality, and you're also getting RAW over HDMI. So I think we've pretty much covered all the basics, and we can move forward, Sean, unless you have anything you want to add.
So the only thing I do want to add is so last week we, like I said, we did have that BGH1 stream, and I actually just want to clarify one of the points that I made last week that actually it was 2 weeks ago, that I actually learned something myself through a lot of this stuff, kind of proof that we all will be learning this stuff as we go along in some cases. And that actually has to go with power zoom lenses when you're working with BGH1. I know you and I have had conversations about this a lot, Matt, that the BGH1 has a remote port on the camera that if you're using the remote controllers and you're running a power zoom lens, whether it's an adapted lens that supports power zoom for the most part, no guarantees because there's third-party pieces involved in that, or if you're using our 2 power zoom lenses that we had a little while ago, you can control focus in the multicam software, but you can't control zoom in the multicam software. That's where you need to have one of those remotes to plug in and then control that way. So I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that. I know I had told a few people and misspoke a couple weeks ago with it, but I'm all for owning up to the points where I totally misspeak and screw up. So we should be clear on that one now. So
yeah.
Let's kind of continue. So, we kind of figured let's knock the kind of big one out of the park first here. So let's talk about the S1H and what is the big deal with Blackmagic RAW, with B-RAW, and how it's implemented in the camera. I know from the time that you and I have been playing with it, which admittedly isn't a whole lot of time working with B-RAW, so I know you guys are gonna have a lot of questions. Um, what are your kind of points with this? I mean, yes, it's raw. Yes, it has that kind of flexibility. But what's the kind of overview for people?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that, Sean, you and I have familiarity with working with raw files from the S1H because we've had it with the Atomos Ninja 5. The problem is that depending on people's workflow, if they're doing their color grading or editing and color grading together in Resolve, ProRes RAW is just not compatible with Resolve at this point. And so, frankly, from my initial experience with working with BRAW, is that it's really very similar to working with the ProRes RAW files. You get the same resolutions, you get the same frame rates. In the menu system, you don't even have to, it's not like we have a separate menu that turns on BRAW and then a separate menu that turns on ProRes RAW. You just turn RAW output over HDMI. When you connect the right device to it, it automatically recognizes that it was either a BRAW device or a ProRes RAW device, and it automatically just works. So the metadata and flagging is all there. It's communicating all of its messaging. You can still use the viewfinder while you're recording, so you don't have to just use the monitor. You still get in-camera tools, so you have the ability to use our vector scope, our waveform monitors if you'd like, our luminance spot meter function. All of those things pretty much stay the same. It's just now you're working in the Davinci Resolve space, or if you're somebody who works in a program like Premiere, there's plugins that Blackmagic has developed that will be available at the time, roughly the same time as we launched this firmware. So it's supposed to, they should be pretty much the same. And that means that you'll have a plugin probably right at the same time. So if you're a Premiere user, great. You can go ahead and work with BRAW if that's your preferred workflow. Or you can work with the inbuilt support that's already developed by Adobe for Premiere. So I think it just adds flexibility so people can work within the NLAs that they want to work in and not have to be beholden just because we chose a specific codec.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there were a lot of questions I know that I was fielding from some of the community over on Facebook, and I see that Dan Hopkins is here, Dennis is here, a couple people that I've communicated with in the other platforms, so it's awesome to see you guys here. And there were actually a lot of conversations going on about when you're working with BRAW and the video assist for this case, which we should very clearly point out as well. BRAW, so Blackmagic RAW on the S1H will require you to use the 12G HDR monitor to do this. Just for those looking, because there's a couple different versions.
Yeah, so they make a 5-inch, they make a 7-inch version, but it's got to have the 12G SDI. We're not using the 12G SDI port. It's the fact that it has the right HDMI port and it has the software and the hardware to be able to do this. That's why you have to be in those 12G models. And then I think it's also important to note, we're not binning or line skipping the footage. You're getting a 5.9K output. You're getting effectively the same resolution as the internal 5.9K that the camera is capable of for RAW, or you're getting an a Super 35 region crop for 4K, C4K or the Cinema 17:9 aspect ratio 4K. And you're also going to get an Academy region as well. And that's, 3.6K, 3.5K, 3.536K, as I can see on my monitor right in front of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sean, you're switching. You're a master of the switcher. You did it. So you get that anamorphic. Yeah, so you get that anamorphic capture functionality as well. None of these are binned or line skipped. It's pixel for pixel. So you're going to get a very nice, clean looking image out of the product. I think a lot of people who work in BRAW are going to be excited to be able to do this from the S1H.
Yeah. And actually, kind of talking about the anamorphic functionality of it, because I know obviously you are an anamorphic buff. You love anamorphic. I'm starting to like it a lot more now that we've got more tools, more lens options are starting to hit the market across the board. Like I've got a couple of the Suryu lenses on loan from them, so I've actually had a chance to play around with it. And one of the questions actually on the Facebook groups, so shout out to all you guys over on the Facebook groups that are submitting these questions, is that when you're working with the ProRes RAW file, or ProRes RAW, when you're working with the BRAW files on this, and to the same point to the ProRes RAW files on the Atomos, there's an inherent difference with the way anamorphic footage is recorded when you're going from ProRes recording, which is contained in a video feed pipeline over HDMI, versus the raw data throughput that happens with BRAW and ProRes RAW. So one of the questions that people had there, Matt, was, when you're using de-squeezing options for previewing it on the monitor, some people were finding that if they de-squeeze anamorphic right now, trying to test and see how the monitor works while they wait for the update, they get pillar boxes and letterboxing on that footage. So could you explain a little bit what the difference is when you're shooting with anamorphic through a video feed over HDMI versus the raw feed over HDMI?
Okay, I think I understood where you're going there.
I'm testing.
One of our coworkers, Peter Preston, had called me, which caused my mic to go mute just for a split second, which is fantastic. So I just put my phone on sleep mode. So thanks, Peter. So to make sure I understand, here's effectively what happens when we're outputting the anamorphic mode to an external monitor as a standard video signal, not a raw signal. We have to conform to the rules that are supported by the HDMI output standard. And so we have to make it fit in a 4096 by 2160 or 3840 by 2160 raster, a resolution window. That's what it has to fit in. And so even though internally we can record, 3,500 pixels, what we end up outputting is about 2,880 pixels as a video stream, because that's what can fit in. You end up with 2160 by 2880 if it's a 4:3 aspect ratio output. So once that goes into the monitor, you're going to have letterbox bars, or in this case, pillar box bars on the left and right, because they're a part of the video signal. And that's why a lot of the monitors have several ways of de-squeezing 2x and allowing you to magnify along with squeezing. Because I think some people, they de-squeeze and then they see pillar box bars on the left and right, and they see letterbox bars at the top and bottom, and they have a little teeny tiny monitor portion here instead of this monitor here. And so it's just cycling through and finding the mode that will allow you to fully magnify the image and de-squeeze it. So there's a couple of different 2x squeeze options in most of these monitors to be able to do that. When you go over the raw image, though, that raw image is not forced into that 3840 by 2160 signal. It is effectively just going out at the full raster. So in this case, it's the 3536. Sorry, my feed looks terrible, so let me just get the proper
3536
numbers.
by 2656.
3536 by 2656. So that's what goes out, and it'll fill the entire height of the screen. And then when you de-squeeze it, you'll de-squeeze it. So you won't have pillar box bars that you have to deal with for this. Oh, and that's the other thing too, is that some 2x squeeze, what they're doing is they're not actually stretching. What they're doing is they're squeezing. And that's why you get the pillar and the letter instead of stretching out. So that's why you have to first magnify to fill the entire screen and then stretch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the kind of perfect example I fully expected you were going to give.
Okay, so Peter didn't ruin it, is what you're saying. Okay, we're good.
No. Peter did fine. So
Right.
obviously with this, that's going to be not necessarily a mass market, kind of concern with using BRAW or any RAW format over HDMI, but I've noticed that there is a very large swell of people getting into this kind of filming. So, it's awesome to see that these people are out there using this, that are, kind of stretching into this market. Along with the, the anamorphic recording, the 5.9K and the 4K, the Cine 4K recording with it, there are a lot of people that are asking questions. I'm not going to call out names particularly because a couple of you have asked the same question here. When you're shooting BRAW out over HDMI, are you able to record internally at the same time?
No, can't do it.
Nope.
Sorry. We just don't have that ability.
Yeah, and that's the same with ProRes RAW. So nothing is different there. But I think one of the cool things that that I've been testing around with this and working with a couple of the people over on the Facebook groups answering some questions was that, when you're working with some of these external monitors, one of the other benefits that a lot of people, look at is, you want to also be able to use the monitor for checking focus if you're manually focusing, especially with the anamorphic lenses. And one of the cool things I found with it, and you guys, it's going to be a little tough to see here, but one of the cool things we found here with this versus, coming from a Ninja, if you've never used one of these before, is that you still do have a kind of quote unquote punch in to monitor your focus while you're doing it. It's a little different than some of the others. It's literally just double tap the screen and it'll punch in for you. So I know Dan and I were having this conversation before he was asking about it. So it does do it for those that are asking with it. And obviously the stuff that we talk about and show right now is working on the firmware that is compatible for the S1H. So your particular unit, if you have it, may not work the exact same way until the firmware comes out. So just be a little aware of that.
Okay.
Let's see.
Sean, I think we may want to talk a bit about workflow here.
Yes.
Because we've just kind of covered the resolutions that the camera's capable of. And there's two different variants of Davinci Resolve. And so I think we might want to get into, what works with what.
That was actually going to be the next kind of point we were going to jump on there. So could you elaborate?
Okay, so Davinci Resolve, the free version of Davinci Resolve, has a resolution limit of 2160 pixels high. That is its limit. Any resolution above that, you need to have the paid version. Our cameras are above that. So you're going to need the paid version if you plan on working within the nonlinear editing functions and color grading and things like that. If you want to just play back your footage, you can play back the footage in the free version of Resolve. So you can use Resolve for checking your footage, but if you're going to edit the footage, you're going to need the studio version of Davinci Resolve. So we just want to make sure we get that out of the way, just so everybody understands.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then where was the other question here? Continuing with this kind of whole, like with BRAW and stuff like that, want to make it clear for a couple people. I see a couple people asking questions about, well, is the Atomos products ever going to add BRAW support for cameras? And truthfully, Matt or I or anyone at Panasonic would have no clue. That is something that you would have to address with Atomos to determine that. But truthfully, stuff like that, I don't think you're ever going to get an answer from a brand one way or another. So for the time being, if you want BRAW, you've got the video assists. If you want ProRes RAW, you've got the Ninja 5s. But as Matt was saying earlier on, I think from a workflow perspective, probably the best thing about our implementation of this capability is that you don't have to change anything. All you do is flip the switch to say RAW out over HDMI, and it knows which monitor you put on there, and it's a turnkey solution for you. There's no need to pay for an upgrade to have your camera updated to do this. There's no need to, change a menu option if you want to jump between the two. You can literally just pull the cable, plug it into the other monitor, give it a second to recognize and, boot up, and then you should be pretty well set for it.
Now, there's one other workflow distinction I want to make between ProRes RAW and BRAW. So it's really in how the devices record their RAW files. There's just a fundamental difference in how Blackmagic records the files versus how Atomos records. And so with the Atomos product, in order for us to give you the full color gamut of vGamut, we had to really strip down that file to its most raw forms. I know that's weird when you're saying raw, but there's different variations of raw. And when we do that, there's a certain amount of video processing that we apply to the file to get the file to achieve this vGamut, this wider color space. And so we had to develop a special LUT that will take the raw file, which the LUT's called, I believe it's called ProRes RAW to vGamut. And you apply that LUT first, and then that gets you into the full vlog vGamut color space. And then you can start working with the file as you see fit. If you're used to working in vlog and vGamut, you just start working from that point, either your LUTs or you just work as your starting point. With BRAW, because of the way they capture the information, we're able to apply that video processing before we're encoding the data. So we can give you just straight vlog LUTs and vlog control. So you get full vgamut, full vlog. And the nice thing is all of the tools are built in to the updated version of Resolve. So you'll see a vgamut option, you'll see a vlog option. The LUT's already there. So you're pretty much ready to go. And then you can work from there and use all those awesome tools that you have in Resolve.
Yeah. Yeah. And originally, I know we had tried to plan to actually show you guys the Resolve and Premiere with a file in here, but just with timing of all of this kind of stuff, Matt and I only just got recorders the other day. In fact, actually, the recorder I have, Matt had for like a couple hours and then had to ship down here so that we could have it on camera. So we'll get you guys more information over time with some of that stuff, or truthfully, you guys may have the opportunity to work with the stuff before, we can actually put together an entire stream about it. But that kind of stuff, if you guys want to hear about workflow, let us know at lumixlive@us.panasonic.com if that's a topic that you guys actually want to, kind of have a session on. We're always open to hearing what you guys say and what you guys want to learn. Let's see if there's any other questions before we jump to the next slide here. Josh Kidd Films. I would assume if you were just coming out normal video signal to the Blackmagic monitor and recording it in normal ProRes, internal will work as well. That is correct. Same as the Ninja product or the Atomos product. If you're just doing ProRes or the Avid files in the recorders, yeah, you can record internal and external at the same time and have your backups done that way. So it will work like a standard monitor. The RAW formats are the ones where it's limited to only the recorder at the time. But talking about that, something I wanted to mention about it too, which I thought truthfully was actually really cool about the video assist here, was really the options of recording media for it. Obviously, if you've been shooting with B-RAW and you've been shooting with these monitors, this is not new. This is not new to any of you guys, but for those of us that haven't, I think this is actually a pretty cool implementation. And that's that you can record as long as your cards are within spec. And I know that's a dirty word, as long as your cards are in spec. You can record 3:1 compression, 12:1 compression, constant quality 0 or 5 to an SD card as long as it's within the specs. So check with Blackmagic's website. They have some guidance on what cards they know are approved. Similar thing about how Atomos has approved SSDs for theirs. But in my initial play around with this so far, I can say that this SanDisk Ultra, so not an expensive SSD, that's on the Atomos approved list, was working fine with 3:1 compression in 5.9K over the USB-C port, which is on the bottom here. And my new generation ProGrade 128 V90 cards was keeping up with it as well. Now, those are initial tests. So something that you guys should definitely be looking at if you do want to try to keep your kit compact, is read all the specs that they have on their website as to what media is designed for it. If you have questions, I'm sure just submit those questions right to Blackmagic. Don't send them to us. We won't be able to answer those. But yeah, it gives you some really nice flexibility. Although a 64 gig SD card in 3:1 compression is like 6 or 7 minutes of recording. So, come on. You can shoot an epic film on that.
You wanted RAW. That's what you get when you get RAW. So there's a couple of other questions I'm seeing in the chat I want to get to real quick, which is
go for it.
Redbit's question, which is, why is 24p, like true cinema 24p, not supported over HDMI? It's not a part of the HDMI specification. The way we packetize the raw information is that frame 1 is all the raw data for frame 1, and then we have to send out frame 2 and frame 3 and frame 4. There's just not a supported true 24 HDMI out, so we can't do true 24. We have to do 23976 which you call 2398, which is what most people call it. The other question is from Cliff Totten. So Cliff, the question is it 12-bit linear or is it 12-bit log that's being sent out the HDMI port? All sensor data is captured linear. So it's always going to be transmitted. If it's truly raw, it should be transmitted as linear data. So it's going to be sent out as linear data, and then it's on the recorder side that is recorded as linear data, and then you're working in either a log space or a linear space. So
I see Brent's question. Can you go over file sizes for the new codecs, whatever the codex is, codexi, whatever the plural of codex is? There are so many variables with some of this stuff, and we just haven't had enough time to be able to actually give you guys that kind of information. So I don't want to misspeak and give you guys a different, kind of opinion. But what I can say is that testing with, as I mentioned before, with 64 gig SD card in 3:1 compression for BRAW for here was only giving me 7 minutes of recording time. So with that, you should be able to roughly extrapolate out. Obviously, the higher the compression, the longer you're going to get.
And Sean, I think the other key is there's options. There's a constant quality and there's a constant bitrate option in the recorder. So if you're going with a constant quality option, it really is going to depend on how much movement is happening in the scene. If we're dealing with, if you have strobe lights or lots of flashing lights in a sequence, that's going to consume more data. What Sean and I are doing would consume very little data. So if you're in constant bit rate at a 3:1, you're getting 7 minutes, and then multiply that by 12, that gets you roughly multiply that by 4, and that should get you roughly what it would be in the 12:1 compression rate. So 7:14, about 28 minutes, give or take, in that mode.
Yeah. All right. I think there are starting to be a lot of questions that are coming in actually about the S1. So let's actually kind of move on over to the S1 now.
Sure.
And Cliff, I'm not ignoring your questions. I was just waiting until we got to the S1 where they're more relevant to answer. So,
yeah.
All right. So obviously with the S1, this is like the biggest update in the firmware that's been released for these cameras. I would arguably say it's probably the biggest one that I've seen in the imaging industry in a long time for a company to update a previous model camera.
Right.
What are some of the call outs that you're really excited about with this one, Matt?
Well, honestly, frankly, everything that's on the slide is relevant. I love the fact that it's giving you the open gate 6K capture. That's 5952 by 3968 in a 3:2 aspect ratio, which means anamorphic lenses are going to be just cool to work with. If you want to use a full frame anamorphic lens on this camera, you're going to be able to do that. Also, just for post cropping is awesome to be able just to shoot with the entire gate and then crop out what you need later on. I think that's just a great feature to have. It's supported up to, and this is important, it's supported up to 2398. So it's not going to be good for PAL users. Sorry, but in the US, it's going to be a great piece of support. That's why there's a 5.4K option that's also 3:2 aspect ratio, and that can get us faster frame rate. That gets us up to the 30 frame, which means 25 frame can be supported there as well. You're getting a bit of a sensor crop, but it's still a very large sensor at that. And then the 5.9K is the full sensor width readout, and that's 30 frames per second. And again, that's internal recording. And these are all 10-bit files. So you're getting a 10-bit file, which means that they're going to grade very nicely. Should be easy to work with. And they're an H.265 codec. And I realize there's some debate, because we do 420 color. Some companies are offering a 422 HEVC variant. We don't want to herniate your computer and cause it to have to be thrown in the garbage. We're trying to work with the HEVC files that were developed for the standard for HEVC. We wanted to work with file formats that we knew would be built into a lot of modern graphics cards. So by working within the HEVC standards and keeping it 420, it means you can throw this on a timeline, and you still have to have a relatively modern computer, but you're going to be able to edit this footage. You're not going to have it just dogging away at a 6K file. So that's a really cool update. I think C4K, for those people who wanted a slightly wider aspect ratio or want some play to be able to crop for 3840 by 2160 presentations, I think that's cool. It gives you 60p and 50p capability. Yes, at 60p and 50p, it is cropped in. It is going to be cropped into the Super 35 region. It's important to understand that's a sensor limitation. That sensor can only read out its speed fast enough in the Super 35 region. So we can't make the sensor read out faster in full frame. It just won't do it. So that's why we're in that crop mode for those outputs. So I think that's a really cool feature. And then it dovetails into the 4K 10-bit option for both 3840 as well as 4096. So you're getting 10-bit all the way into your 4K 60p functionality, which I think is awesome. And then obviously anamorphic functions, I'm a big fan of them. If I'm excited for 6K anamorphic, obviously I'm going to be excited for the Super 35 crop region anamorphic functions as well. And one point of note is that the camera doesn't give you like a 48 frame option. That's a S1H feature. We'll talk about that in a little bit greater detail. But keep in mind that you still have a PAL 50, and the S1 is very easy to switch between PAL and NTSC. So you still have slow-mo for anamorphic if you want it. You just have to put the camera into PAL, shoot that footage in PAL, then switch back to NTSC, and you can shoot the rest of your footage at 24 frame. So you're still getting a slow-mo anamorphic function, which I think is killer to have.
Yeah, definitely.
Now I will say this: with great power comes great responsibility. So at Panasonic, there's a few limitations with the camera. It doesn't have the fan that's inbuilt in the S1H, and so we have to be cognizant of the thermal management of the product. And so you're going to see recording limits. There's a 15-minute recording limit on all of the 5. Anything that's over 4096, you're going to have a 15-minute recording limit. Anything that does 60p and 4K, there's going to be about a 30-minute recording limit, 29 minutes to 59 seconds. These are thermal considerations. It's simply, we can't get as much out of this body as we can out of an S1H. And again, we hold ourselves to a pretty high standard. This assumes an ambient temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, if you're recording at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the camera wouldn't overheat as quickly, but we have to take into consideration the fact that someone may be shooting at 104 degrees. And so that's why those recording limits are there. Keep in mind, in many cases, you'll just be able to hit record once again and pick up where you left off. In some cases, you may have to wait a couple minutes for it to cool down. But the heat is not stored in the camera. We're using the camera as a heat sink, so it should be quick to dissipate that heat.
Yeah. So, looking at kind of this huge list here, I mean, there's obviously some of the limitations that you talked about, with thermal management and maintaining that what we say the camera can do is what it can do, and that the quality stays to our standard. Because if anyone's ever looked, that as electronics get hotter and hotter and hotter, image quality degrades as they get hotter and they stay warmer. So if you're an astrophotographer, you've dealt with this for a long time. So there has to be, kind of quality points set in there. And then, you throw into the fact, I know that there's a couple people that have been asking questions about, well, the S1 has the XQD and the CF Express Type B slots in there, which have crazy throughput, which I don't think anyone would argue with you guys. But there's some challenges there too, in that, if you've ever shot a long day with the XQD cards, not CF Express, with XQD cards, and pulled that card out of the camera, they're pretty hot. So there's more than just the sensor or the processor generating heat inside of the camera. The memory cards are also a thermal generating point in these platforms, which is one of the cool things why I think the implementation of CF Express really is actually kind of an awesome thing to add to the cameras, because the thermal generation on those is much, much lower than the original standard. So, but
keep in mind that it's still a much higher thermal load than an SD card. So even a CF Express card, which is much cooler than what you would have in potentially an XQD card, it's still going to carry more thermal, it's going to carry higher temperatures than an SD card would. So,
Exactly.
sometimes recording limits are instituted in one product because it has the potential of having an issue because of a different media as well. So, you got to keep that in mind. Some people like to look at this and say, well, the GH5 or the box camera can do all these things without these thermal limits. But you got to remember that we have different media in this product. We have a different sensor in this product. They all have very different thresholds for how much thermal limit they have and when we'll start to see noise begin to creep into the image. So all those things have to be factored.
Yeah. So one of the other questions here that came up was, why is it not possible to shoot 5.9K ProRes just as a backup file to the internal 5.9K? Is it a limitation of the monitor? And that comes from Jonathan. I know you and I have talked about this before because of sending a video feed out. Do you have a answer we can give them?
Sure. So again, I'm assuming we're not talking about RAW. We're just talking about internal recording
ProRes
and then having a ProRes file. Okay. So the issue we run into again is that the HDMI connector that we use for the S1H doesn't have the ability to pass an 8K file. So because we don't have the ability to pass an 8K file, we would have no way to packetize that 5.9K and put pillar bars and letterbox bars around the image. There is no 5.9K standard for HDMI. There's simply no way to send that data over HDMI. So we have to work within the approved standards that can be passed out in HDMI connector. And so that's where that limitation comes in. Now with RAW, we can play fast and loose as long as we're working in the frame rates. It's just data packets at that point, and we can do things like that. But then you can't record internally. So that's the limitation, is that we just don't have an 8K HDMI output. If it had 8K HDMI, sure, we could have figured out a way to packetize that 5K in and send it out. But then the recorder would have to be able to accept 8K on the input. And to my knowledge, these recorders do not have an HDMI port that can pass 8 or can accept 8K. So you would have a limitation on the recorder, and you have a limitation on what the camera can output. And that's really what's causing this.
Cool. So I think that answers Jonathan's question there. Let's see if there's any other questions before we jump to the next slide here. Because I know that there's a lot of people asking about time code, and that's going to be the next thing that we talk about.
Yeah. Well, not the next thing, but the next thing.
Next thing. Yeah. Let's see here. Others are asking about 48 frame over HDMI.
We'll get to that, Sean. We will get to that. So
we will.
We'll get to that in a little bit.
All right. And then to just answer Cliff's question here. So obviously, as we said with the S1, there are the internal recording time limits for the 5.9K, 6K, things like that. But if you are sending the footage out over HDMI in ProRes RAW, or RAW over HDMI, there are no limitations. You are not thermally limited. You're not having to worry about, starting and stopping a clip. And that's the same if you're using like 4K out for 60p into ProRes or Avid or DNX HD, whatever it's called. Shows how much I know about some of that stuff. There's no time limits if you're sending it out over HDMI because the, processing thermals, things like that, you're offloading a lot of that to recorders for that side of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think, keep in mind that we know people want to use an S1 for live streaming, just like we're doing right here. And so, people want to be able to do extended live streaming over HDMI, and that would be no limitation that we input on the product. A lot of this really comes down to what's happening once it's time to record the file and once it's time to encode it into some sort of a compression codec. There's a lot of processing that's happening at that point, and that's where a lot of thermal issues come into play. And then on top of that, as we mentioned earlier, with CF Express and XQD cards, they can generate a little bit more heat. So just keep all of that in mind. That's where those thresholds come in. Send it out the HDMI port, record it to your external recorder. Do that until your SSD is full and you're ready to go.
Yeah. All right. So let's jump over to the next one here because obviously, we have the RAW out over HDMI, which we touched on before, which the S1's now getting ProRes RAW out over HDMI. And then,
Yeah. So
some of the other updates. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's clarify that. We're doing RAW over HDMI. And
RAW
then
over HDMI.
the recorder, the recorder ultimately decides what's recorded. We have metadata packets, things like that we have to put in there so that we know what we're communicating with. We're just sending RAW over HDMI. It's really the recorder that decides what we're recording. But yeah, in this case, we worked with Atomos. This camera will get ProRes RAW implementation. 5.9K. Cliff, I know you asked, so I will answer. What is the difference between the S1H 5.9K RAW and the S1 5.9K RAW? The fact that the S1H has an optical low-pass filter and the S1 does not. That will be the only real distinguishing characteristic between the two. There is no difference. So you're getting effectively the same RAW image you get from the S1H. So you get 5.9K RAW, you get the anamorphic function, you also get the Cinema 4K up to 60p and the Super 35 crop. So you get all of that great stuff for RAW. It's already it's going to be in the camera with that firmware update. I'm pretty excited because it sets a pretty interesting price barrier at $2,500. It's a very low cost option, especially with a full size HDMI port. I think that's going to be pretty exciting. The time code question, I know it's been asked a few times, so we'll cover what the difference between the time code. The point is that the S1 had no time code ability. You had no ability to run a time code in the camera. You couldn't start a time code, stop one, free run, rec run. None of that stuff existed in the S1. So the S5 had a time code function that will not allow it to accept time code from an external source, but I can restart it and I can set my time code on that camera and have it run. The S1 gets the same time code implementation as the S5. That's what you're going to get. And we'll discuss the differences between S1H and S1 in a moment for time code. And then as we mentioned earlier, hey, if you're going to put in a camera trap, you got the ability to use the power save functions, and you can choose whether or not you want metadata for vertical video.
Yeah. And for that time code point, I know like just you said, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but for everyone out there that has been reaching out to us over and over again about how you want to be able to trigger your recorder with your S1, now you have the ability to do it. That's that part that was missing. You will want to make sure, just like the other cameras, that you turn time code on in the camera, and then you'll see an option to send time code over HDMI. And then you'll also need to go into the record out menu or the HDMI out menu and turn on HDMI record. I think it's HDMI record control. You will also want to turn that on. You'll know it's on when on the back of the camera, you'll have a little HDMI in red with a pause little symbol next to it in the top left of the screen. When you see that, you'll be able to just press the record button on the camera. It'll trigger recording on the recorder, and you're golden. You're good to go. So hopefully that makes those of you that have been kind of frustrated with that a little bit happier that it was addressed.
I think right now a clear indicator that you're going to get that feature is if there's RAW over HDMI out. As of today, and obviously our engineers may change their minds at some point, but as of today, if we're doing RAW over HDMI, we're going to give you that functionality because it hardly seems appropriate not to have it. So as you see cameras get ProRes RAW or BRAW, just assume that you're going to get that functionality, unless Sean tells you differently. Okay.
Sure. Put that one on me.
Yeah. Well,
the truth is, nothing is official until you see it in a press release from Panasonic.
I know. So I think the next slide that's up, I think it's interesting because the next slide really shows people how many new codecs we've added to the S1, not just in this announcement, but actually in the previous one that we did as well. So when we added features like the 4K 10-bit functions, those are 3 additions that we had made previously. Now you're getting all of these additional features as well for all these different codecs. And again, we never committed at the S1's launch that it was going to be anything like this. So it just shows you that we're listening to the market. We're hearing what you guys are doing with the product, and we're trying our best to make sure we give you a very powerful set of video features in the S1.
Yeah. So, anecdotally, we've always, had the conversations internally in the company, when we work with our sales team, we work with our trainers, the team across the board. And it's always funny when these slides come up, because it's like how much has been added into these cameras for frame rates, for resolutions, how much detail goes into it. You can see why, looking at this, we went to this format to show you guys, because there's no way Matt and I would remember all of this. And we work for the company and work with these cameras every single day. So always trying to get as accurate of information out as we possibly can. Let's see if there are other questions before we jump to the next slide here, because I think the next one is just showing the ProRes RAW out. So Chris is asking, once you reach the 15-minute limit, can you just hit record immediately and start recording again? I know I've played around with it a little bit.
That really depends. How hot is the camera at the time? Does it need to cool down or not? If the camera doesn't need to cool down because it's not reached the thermal threshold, yeah, just hit record again and start recording. That's been my experience with the S5, the S1, with the GH, well, not the GH, but actually, yeah, I did one time have a GH overheat because I had it in direct, a GH5 in direct sunlight. It was like 114 degrees out, and that one overheated on me one time. And I took it to the car. I ran it in front of the vents for the car for about 5 minutes, brought it back out with an umbrella, and set up a C-stand with it was actually an umbrella you use for flash photography that had the black backing on it. So I put that over me so I could keep the camera out of the sun, and it was fine.
Yeah.
So we're usually pretty quick with that. It just depends on how hot the camera is at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the same kind of thing I found here. Back with the S5, it was still really warm down here in Texas. So we were able to, have like 100-degree day out, 100-degree Fahrenheit day out, and have the camera running constantly. And at that point, we were actually pressing the 6K photo mode, because that was one of the highest heat generating modes in the camera. And I don't think I ever got it to actually thermal, but, we're in shade. So simple thing, if you're out in broad daylight and it's really hot out and, humid, just cover over. Get a giant gobo or something and just put it over top of you so that you've got a little bit of shade, and you'll probably mitigate 90% of the thermal issues that you could potentially have with any camera. Well, not any camera. Some cameras. So let's see here. What other question here? Chris is also asking, does the S1 get the ability to decouple the focus assist so you can use a magnified EVF while recording externally, same as the S1H can? I haven't actually checked that.
No, I did. I'll double check. Why don't you talk and I'll look? How does that sound?
Yeah, sure. All right. So we're gonna check on that one, Chris. The other question here from Keith. Matt said the S1 could not be, or quote unquote, Matt said the S1 could not be a Netflix approved camera for lack of timecode input, but with the Ninja 5 and SDI daughter card. With the SDI daughter card has that. Wikipedia says ProRes 422 is an all-I. Okay, I think there's a couple of conversations going on in that one comment. I can answer this one for Matt. We don't control what cameras get approved by Netflix. It's up to them. If a camera fits and meets into their specifications and all of their requirements, we know that timecode is one of the requirements because they state time code on their website for what a camera can get into it, but it's never as simple as just the basic stuff you see online. So that's not something we'd be able to tell you now anyway. So
yeah, and I think again, I think the key is that if we just look at the standard, there are certain things they require. The S1 doesn't have a few of those things. So I don't know that we would even bother to submit it to Netflix to get it certified. You'd have to give a pretty good justification for why it would qualify. And just knowing what we know, I don't see a way for that to happen with the S1H. I'm sorry, with the S1. And keep in mind, if we're limiting the recording time to 15 minutes at 200 megabit codec, what do you think we'd have to limit it to for an all-I codec? And And keep in mind that getting a Netflix certification is not about, it's not like getting a a logo on the front of a surround receiver where you don't really have to do much to get it, and you're really just paying a licensing fee. There's no licensing fee for this stuff. There's production needs that Netflix has, and if your product can meet their production needs and meets their minimum standards, they'll do it. I can't just not me personally, but we can't just throw an all-I codec in there, give it 2.5 minutes of recording time, and then pawn it off to Netflix and say, here, go ahead and try this. It does all I now. That's not going to work. They're not going to approve it for that. So just keep a few things in mind that if we can't put a reasonable all-I recording in there, there's just no way for us to get a certification.
Yeah,
that's probably more than I needed to give, by the way.
No, that's perfectly fine. So Brandon has a question. Brandon Marsh. Can the S1 do B-RAW as well, or is this a limitation on the S1 versus the S1H? Do you want to handle the answer to that one?
We don't know.
It's the same.
We don't.
Same
we
answer
honestly.
I was gonna give.
We don't know. We have no idea. That's our engineers will make that determination. I think we have to sort of baby step this out and see how the S1H is received first, and then if it's well received, we get a lot of feedback for B-RAW and certain other cameras. Then we can start evaluating whether or not it makes sense to try to implement it, or if there's specific hardware limitations that would prevent it.
Yeah. All right. Let's see the next question here. Oh, and one of the things that actually Matt and I forgot to mention at the beginning of talking about the S1. If you've been looking at these slides, there's an important thing that I think if you're an S1 owner, you need to be aware of with these updates. In order to take advantage of things like ProRes RAW, in order to take advantage of the 6K internal, the 5.9K, 5.4K, all of these new additions that are coming into the version 2.0 firmware, your camera does have to have the SFU2 upgrade on it for these particular features to be added in. Now, there was a question in the chat that was asking, and I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide here. One of the questions was, well, if you don't have the SFU2 upgrade, do you still get dual native ISO functionality? And the cool thing is, yes, you do. You get the manual selection of dual native ISO. You get that vertical playback, metadata triggering or manual triggering, and you get the power saving mode. All of the other additions to this, you do need to have that SFU2 upgrade. But cool thing, if you already have it, don't worry. Just put the firmware update on the camera. Everything's there. You're good to go. You don't have to do anything for it. You're all set. If you don't have it, probably a good time to maybe take a look around and see if you can get one. Check with your different dealers out there, because they are out there, and get your camera set up ready to go for it. Let us...
So I think, so Sean, I'm thinking we should probably jump ahead to where we do the S1 versus S1H. Because I think there's probably a lot of questions out there about, I bought an S1H, so why did I do that? Yes. How does the S1 and S1H differ from each other? And so Sean and I sat down and we looked at this, and we even forgot one, which is decoupling the manual focus that you can do in the S1H that you can't do in the S1. So that's not on here, but that is an S1H benefit. Sean and I were actually very surprised at how different these cameras really are once we sat down and we went through it. So when we look at the S1, you get ProRes RAW, the S1H, you get B-RAW and ProRes RAW. That's obvious. You get the long GOP codecs in the S1H. You don't get long GOP codecs on the S1. The unlimited recording time in all modes. And I think that's a key to understand with the S1H. Every mode in the S1H is unlimited recording time. Even 180 frame per second, 1080 is unlimited. Yeah. Why you would need an unlimited 180 frame per second is left up to a debate, but you get it. Okay. The screen is the dual articulating design. I have a somewhat rigged up S1H here, and so it gives you the ability to flip the screen like this, or you can articulate the screen like that, and they work together to clear the HDMI port, so you don't have to worry about hitting the HDMI port with your screen. So you get that with the S1H. You don't obviously no firmware update's going to add that to your S1. That'd be an awesome firmware update, but we just don't have that ability. The top plate differences are very significant. The screen that's on the top of the S1H is much nicer, and frankly allows you to cycle with a push button between two different pages of information. So it's much easier for me to be able to see what I'm doing on an S1H without having to look on the back screen. So if I need to know what frame rate, resolution, codec, if I need to know all those things, I can see it from the top plate. Battery information for both battery, if you're using a battery grip, all of that stuff's displayed there.
Yeah.
You get a vector scope along with waveform monitor on the S1H. The S1 only gets waveform monitor, so no vector scope. The luminance spot meter is in the S1H. There is no luminance spot meter function in the S1. So I use that an awful lot when I'm shooting in Vlog, is the luminance spot meter. It's become sort of a mandatory for me to use at this point.
Same here.
The dual zebras are different. So you have two different zebras you can set on an S1, but on an S1H, I can display them both simultaneously if I wanted. So I could have a low and a high zebra that shows up at the same time. Or I can assign practically any value I want to a zebra in the S1H. So if I want to set a value to exactly 42 IRE, so it shows zebras on skin tone, so I know I'm exposed correctly in Vlog, I can do that on the S1H. You can't do that on the S1. The time code is different. So when we look at the S1H, I keep a cable dangling from the front of it. This is my time code cable. So this allows me, and I'm not in autofocus right now, so I apologize, but this cable allows me to bring time code in from an external source. The S1 doesn't have the component inside the camera to be able to do that. So you'll never be able to bring time code into an S1.
Yeah.
The S1H gets true cinema 24p. Now, for a lot of people, if you're doing just YouTube work or television work, this is not a big deal. But if you're planning on displaying at a theater as a theatrical presentation, if you're going to deliver a DCP file, DCP files are 24, they're not 2398, which means there's a lot of work you have to do to keep your audio synced up to convert from 2398 to 24. Also, if I'm trying to match a film-based camera like a Panavision or an Arriflex camera, I can match better with 24. So that is a significant difference. One of my favorite differences is that the S1H gets a high frame rate mode. The S1 only gets the VFR, which means when I'm doing things like 120 frame or 180 frame per second, 1080, I'm getting 8-bit. I have no autofocus and I get no audio. If I'm in particular 120, that's a limitation. With high frame rate mode, we're going to give you a native codec 120 frame 10-bit. We're going to give you a 48 frame as well, and 100 for PAL regions. And that means that it's literally going to play back at 100 frames per second. It's not going to be slowed down. It's going to be 10-bit, and it gives you audio and autofocus. Those are big features. You also get synchro scan, which I know Sean uses because his LED lights behind him are constantly flickering if he doesn't. So synchro scan allows us to choose fractions of a shutter speed to really tailor the shutter speed to get rid of flicker. You get master pedestal function in the S1H. So if you're going to match other brands of cameras, black levels, you can do that. Or if you want to lift the shadows a bit, you can use master ped to lift shadows a bit. The audio differences are stark between the S1 and the S1H. You have the ability to go plus or minus 18 dB, I'm sorry, minus 18 dB on the S1H. So you have more level control on the S1H. But more importantly, you actually have a low and high gain option on the S1H. So this gives it a massive amount of microphones that it's compatible with. Segmented recording, loop recording, those are all functions that are in the S1H. They're not in the S1. The focus transition function, if you want a focus puller look, but you don't want to hire a focus puller, focus transition does a very good job of this. And we have a video that shows how to do it on our YouTube channel.
Yep.
When you're talking about using adapted lenses with an S1, you can really just set the focal length for the adapted lens, and that's about it when we're talking about stabilization. When we use an S1H, you have tremendous control over that lens. You can even control how much stabilization to correct for any vignetting that's in the lens. So we can reduce the amount of movement the sensor makes when it's being used on a lens that may have some vignetting. So we can keep it within that vignetting region. You get tally light on the front of the camera and the back of the camera on the S1H. There's no tally lights on the S1. And obviously, we incorporate a low-pass filter on the S1H because we are targeting a very specific look, and that moire that could be introduced with really, really tight patterns is not always appealing. So it's a lot of differences. Once you actually look at it, there's quite a few differences between these two cameras.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just as Matt said, when we did this and we put the setup, kind of going through this list, looking at everything side by side, it was a pretty stark, kind of look at that. And, yeah, as some people are mentioning, like Cliff mentions, we left out the cooling fan in the S1H. And yes, that is a vast difference between the two, but that's really the active cooling in the S1H is what gives us the unlimited recording. It's what allows us to, push the capabilities of the camera further than what the other ones do. And there's a lot of people asking about, that 48 frame, the high frame rate that, we talked about before, and, wanting it in their S1s or an S5. And truthfully, I don't know if there's a limitation or what the limitation would be for it, as to why it's not in some of the other cameras, other than, the other cameras don't have the high frame rate functionality into them currently.
Sean, there's one consideration, and I can't, obviously we're not the engineering team, so we can't give you a thoroughly vetted answer to this. But yes. There is no standard for 48 frame playback on a television set over HDMI or as a codec. So if you shoot 48 frames of your kid's soccer game and you bring that home to play it back on your television set, it's not going to play. So sometimes you have to look at market segmentation and say, at this price point, how many people will shoot in this mode and then create customer service issues where they're dissatisfied with the product. So if we have people shooting 48 frame for their kids' soccer games and then they go to stick it in a television set and it doesn't play back, it all of a sudden creates a problem for us on the customer service side where we're constantly having to deal with those problems and explain, don't do that anymore. Whereas the S1H is clearly targeted at a professional shooter, somebody who understands that there's not a 48 frame codec for a television set. So they're using it specifically for slow-mo, and that's its entire reason for existing for most of those people. So sometimes you have to think of it as, at the price point this camera is, how many people could accidentally shoot in that mode and create problems for themselves? And so that sometimes goes into the decision-making process. I know you're not going to like that answer. I understand that there's going to be some people who are not going to be happy with that answer. But you have to think bigger picture as to how it impacts the overall market, not just a smaller subset of users.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's kind of one of the things that like a lot of us have always kind of, really run into that. And, there's comments that a lot of people are saying about, how some other cameras may be supporting 48 frame. And that all fills into that exact point that Matt just made, is that is an average person looking at buying the camera that's not necessarily like a lot of those of us that are in this industry, that are working day in and day out, that are, sitting on the live stream here, wanting to have a conversation and a deep technical conversation about this stuff. It can cause a lot of challenges for some people. So, that may not be the best answer that you guys want to hear. And it's definitely one of those things that, from Matt and I, every time you guys reference and ask, why isn't 48 frame in this camera? Why isn't this feature in this camera? We always do feed this up. So, don't be disheartened because this is the current state of certain features, things like that. That's why we're doing these streams, is you guys comment this stuff. Matt and I added it into the reports that we do, because again, I always kind of laugh at that because it's, it's an electronics company. We do reports all the time and feedback information that you guys give us to our bosses, to the engineering teams in Japan. So if you guys mention something, it gets to us and it gets to the teams that are there. So,
well, and Sean, don't forget, you can shoot in 4K 50. And 50 is very close to 48, and that gives you the autofocus. It gives you sound recording, and that is a very good compromise for 4K 48.
Yeah. Let's see here. What other questions we got? Because we are running a little long today.
Yes,
but
sir.
I want to make sure we get to if there's any kind of major question, I know that we said we would address before. Some of the questions were, is there any chance of getting 48 HFR 48 frame without a crop on the camera?
No,
Yeah.
it's just a
Hardware
readout speed
limitations.
issue of the sensor.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's limited 48 frame, Super 35 for that region there. Let's see if there's any other last questions here. There's a lot of people asking about 24 frame per second 1080p in the S1, which the S1 does have a 24 frame per second 1080p recording. You do just have to switch it over to AVC HD for that recording. So again, that's where the S1 is. The S1H is what gives you 24 frame per second in MOV. Little difference
in 1080.
In 1080. Let's see here. Is there a reason why false color is not added in as a tool in our cameras?
It wasn't thought about when we developed them. I don't have a good answer for that one.
I don't either.
We've asked for it. We know that there's several LUTs that you can acquire that you can load onto the card. You could load that as a log LUT for false color. That's not going to really work if you don't want to work in log, though. So it's something we've asked for. It's something that we would be interested in seeing as well. I just don't know how much time or effort it takes to develop that, and I don't know if all the hardware exists in the camera to be able to do it. So some of those things are just, when we're planning the engine for these cameras, we're looking like maybe 3 years ago when it was in the planning stage, and they may not have thought to put false color as an option on the engine at the time. So we'll ask again, but that's probably the reason why.
And then the last question we're going to take for today, just because of time constraints, Chris has asked a couple of times, so I want to make sure I get to this question, was can we now use the gimbals with USB focus functions and not have the monitor stop working on the S1? So I know that there are a couple of the gimbals out there that have had some weird results with the S1 after the last couple of updates. As far as I know, and Matt, maybe you know something more than I do. As far as I know, yeah, that's what I figured. We have provided the control SDK for the USB controls of the S series cameras into the public. It's a publicly available SDK. If the company that you're using has the gimbal and it doesn't seem to be working, or you're getting some weird functionality, like I know you were saying, Chris is saying that when they plug it in, the screen will go black. Maybe give them a poke and say, hey, the SDK is out there. Maybe you can update your system to, with the control set that works for our cameras, because we've put the information out there publicly. That should fix the issues you're having there, because we're making the information available. It's up to the accessory partner to build or update their product to conform to the information we've provided them. So,
yeah. If you want proof of what Sean's saying, download the Lumix Tether for Stream app, which is a beta we have. You're connected out over USB. You can clearly see the LCD screen still works, and you're able to control the camera right over the USB port. So we're also doing that on the box cameras. Sean and I are on box cameras now, and they work on a Tether app that gives us tremendous control over the cameras. None of that would be causing the problem. So it's probably something on the gimbal side. That would appear to be the case.
So yeah, I know Chris is saying that it's it works fine on the S1H but not on the S1, but that's kind of that point. You don't know what they're using for identifying what the device is, how it's controlling the camera. That's why we put the SDK out. So it's not as simple as just saying it's not the SDK because it works on one or the other. Every camera is unique in its own set. So, you have to, that's why we put the SDK out, is to hopefully be able to address some of those issues for those that are developing this stuff. And Cliff, I'm going to say it, we have nothing on more GH cameras, so sorry. And, honestly, with that, we're going to have to actually wrap this up because I know Matt and I have some other things that we have on our schedules today. So thank you, Matt, for spending the time and having this really fun session with me today.
Well, and thanks for hosting it. Thanks. I know this is a big part of your brainchild, and it takes a lot of work for you to set these up every week. You do a good job with them, so keep doing what you're doing, and I'm happy to come on any other time. So thank you, everybody out there. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. All right, so everybody, just as a reminder, so we will be live again next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for another Lumix Live session. I'm not going to give away what that session is for next week, but it's definitely going to be a fun one, so you're probably going to want to tune into that. Outside of that, just as a reminder, Lumix Pro Services, we've got that red level membership, which is free. We have the platinum level membership, which is for the higher end users that really demands a lot out of your equipment. You can check out the QR codes for the US market. If you're not in the US market, take a look at lumix-pro.com, and then you can check out your region for support in your area. With that, again, thank you everybody for joining us. Make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel here. Share these videos out with people that you may think would find these interesting. It helps us out incredibly to continue bringing you guys more of this kind of content and expanding this platform even further. With that, thank you for joining me. We'll see you guys next Thursday at 2 p.m. You guys have a good week.